to Moretospacethanair with Ayomide Adefe Gideomole. Today I have with me Mr. Bryant A. Mishima-Baker, who is an active duty captain and attorney with the Air Force Victims Counsel Division, currently assigned to Joint Base Emmendorf, Richardson, Arkansas. He has been actively involved in the study and practice of space law and policy since 2011, starting in the American Bar Association Space Law Forum and the Space Frontier Foundation Space Policy Team in Washington, D.C. Mr. Baker has published multiple articles questioning the legal regimes in place regarding military involvement in space, as well as the need for a unified goal of space expansion for the United States. He graduated from the Space Studies program at North Dakota University with a master's degree on their space policy track and serves as a volunteer legal expert for NASA's think tank Space Propulsion Synergy Team, SPST. Thank you so much for joining me today, Bryant. I am very excited to speak with you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to our discussion. It's been a long time coming, and I'm so grateful that we've finally been able to do this.
Yeah, I'm so glad you could also make it. Okay, so just as a bit of a throwing into the discussion for today, could you please introduce yourself further and lead us through your career in space and any other interesting thing that you might want to add at this time?
Sure. So my career in space has been and continues to be a little bit of an unusual one. So a fairly typical young man growing up in the United States, I decided from about the age of 5 that I was going to be an astronaut, and that was the assumption all through school and high school and even into the beginning of my university career. I started as a volunteer at age 12 or 13 in our local Christa McAuliffe Space Education Center, which was a local education camp that had space themes and STEM education and stuff like that. So volunteered there for several years. Started my my university degree assuming that I was going to be an engineer. I started in engineering, did all of the math, the science, all of the preliminary things, but discovered rather quickly that I was much more enamored with the stories, the policies, the human side of the space endeavor, as opposed to the science and mathematics and engineering parts of it, which came as a huge shock and kind of surprise for me. So made the somewhat disappointing personally decision to walk away from that. And after completing my bachelor's degree, ended up going to law school because I liked the pursuit of sort of this intellectual and policy side of things so much. And it wasn't until law school in my second year, as you may know, in the United States, law school is considered a graduate degree after your original degree. And it wasn't until my second year in law school when I was going through the optional courses that I wanted to take. And lo and behold, way down on the list, near the bottom, is this course called Space Law. And you should have seen my eyes bulge out of my head. I could not believe that that existed, that was a thing. So I was very lucky to be attending a university that had that being taught. And I took that course. This was back in 2011, and I have been hooked ever since. I have been involved, as you mentioned, with the ABA's Space Law Forum. I got immediately involved in any organization that I could take part in. Currently, as you mentioned, I am the legal advisor to the Space Propulsion Synergy Team. I'm also a member of the International Institute of Space Law. I recently volunteered to be one of the coordinators for the Manfred Locke's Space Law Moot Court competition and handling the Asia Pacific region for them. I try to be as involved as I can in publications and just being involved in whatever way that I can. Prior to being involved on the volunteer side, I also made the decision after graduating law school and practicing for a year or two in Washington, D.C., I just made the decision, listen, I need to be more involved with this. I need to find an avenue into practicing more space involved stuff. But I wasn't as convinced anymore that I wanted to do that in the legal sense. So I ended up joining the Air Force, which of course at the time had the full space mission involved, not as a lawyer, but as an officer. And did that for 2 years until I had a wonderful conversation with one of my leadership after about 2 years. He brought me into his office in a very kind and loving but stern mentoring sort of way, looked at me and said, Baker, you're a licensed attorney. You've practiced for many years. What are you doing here? And I told him about my goals and aspirations for being involved in the development of space laws and policies and practices and regulations and what have you. And he very kindly shook his head at me, smiled, and said, well, then we need you over in the legal office. And in a quite unusual turn of events, as far as I know, the first time that this has ever happened, at least within the last 50, 60 years or so, they ended up, while I was still under contract as a regular line officer, they transferred me over and made me an attorney with the Air Force, and I've been working there ever since, and have had some wonderful opportunities to interact both with people who are dealing directly with the space mission, as well as others who are more tangentially just involved in the thought processes of the development of space. It's been a wonderful opportunity. Speaking of which, I should probably mention, I don't anticipate we'll talk too much about the specifics of Air Force or anything, but I am obligated to say that everything that I do say is my own opinion and doesn't necessarily reflect the policies or current stances or views of anyone outside myself, to include my employer, etc. So just so there's not any misunderstanding there.
What an interesting journey you have had. I guess my next question to you would be, what does it mean to be a space law attorney? I'm really curious.
I think that's an excellent question. And I think that it is a question that we are still trying to figure out, and that might not have any definite answers, because the most obvious answer is a space lawyer is any attorney that is practicing law in a field that applies to outer space. But that's such a broad definition that anything could fit under that umbrella. And for some, I think that is a wonderful thing. For some, the idea of, well, wait a minute, you mean that I can practice property law and be involved in the space industry? You mean I can practice contracting law? And if I'm doing it for a space company, then I'm practicing space law? How wonderful. So for some, that can be great. For others, like myself, I like to describe it a little bit more narrowly. For me, I think the practice of space law really is more of the use of law, particularly international law, to decide the big questions of what is and is not okay in the space domain. I know many who would disagree with that definition, because it can be looked at so broadly, but that's where my interest is. What are the rules that we're going to apply to ensure that we as human beings are utilizing space to its maximum potential to benefit mankind? That's what I'm interested in.
And that's really profound. My next question to you is, how will you define your role in the industry, and perhaps who would you consider are the major players, and how does your role interact with them?
That's an excellent question. You know what? I think, like most professionals, I look at my role in international law as a developing one. So currently, I had had the great pleasure of working in the Air Force for almost 8 years now. Although I have been stationed at Space Force bases and had some wonderful interactions there, I've never had the job of giving direct advice on space law issues to commanders. There are very few jobs that exist for that purpose, and there are some wonderful minds that do that. And I would love to see that in my near future. But I'd like to think that, especially with the development of space law and policies, the decisions of what direction nations are going to move in and what are the important things that we as human beings should be trying to do, I think there is lots of room for individuals to be making educated choices and advocating for choices that don't necessarily involve their career title. One of my favorite persons from the history of space is Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. I'm sure you're very familiar with the Russian scientist from way back when, one of the premier developers of the ideas of space. And as I'm sure you and probably your listeners are familiar with, for the most part, he did most of his work as a school teacher in his private time. And in a shocking and an amazing way, he was able to think through many of the technicalities and the math behind what has become the fundamental parts of the space industry. Now, I like you mentioned, I had the opportunity to get a master's degree in space studies, focusing on space policy, and had some wonderful opportunities to interact with a few people there. And one of the professors, I remember asking him, do you think that that's ever going to be possible again? Are we living in a world where a single person just utilizing their mind and really thinking through things can no longer make those kinds of revolutionary discoveries and ideas? And he said, in all honesty, no, I think we're beyond that. The level of engineering and the sciences are so complicated now that if it's not as part of a group, it's not possible anymore. And I tend to agree with his assessment, but I don't think that that's the same when it comes to the laws, the policies, the philosophy behind the engineering and the science. There, I would say, for anyone who's interested in getting involved with space law and policy, it doesn't matter. We live in a world where it doesn't matter as much anymore whether you're a school teacher or whether you've been practicing law in the field of space for 20 or 30 years. Great ideas are coming from all over the place. And thanks to the openness that has become available with technology, the fact that we can talk to each other via the internet and publish that for anybody who's interested in listening to, I think it's a very exciting time to start solving some of the fundamental ideas and problems that have been plaguing this industry from a legal and policy standpoint for the last 60, 70 years.
Thank you so much for that. My next question to you is on how you were able to transition into this role that you have currently, and perhaps if you want to share with us the challenges that you have encountered in this role, and generally any advice to young professionals who are looking to currently to toward the same path.
Sure. So for me, I think transitioning into trying to be as involved in the space industry as possible has involved a lot of trying to make myself available and trying to get in touch with the right players who maybe and have the right conversations. One of my pet peeves that exists in the space world, unfortunately, is the high importance that gets placed on the networking events, the conferences. Some of these conferences have a wonderful opportunity to hear and learn something that's new and amazing, but not all of them. Many of them are just gatherings of people to try to get to know each other and form those connections. And as frustrating as that can be sometimes, it's incredibly important to know who to go to, because everybody has a different perspective about what the problems are and different inputs as to what is needed in order to create a good answer to the questions that we're currently facing. So for me, very important to slipping into the roles with the International Institute of Space Law, whether it be with the Space Synergy team. Many of these were invitations that I received because of a conversation that I had with somebody, or because of a connection that I had, or simply because I'm very active on LinkedIn. This is how we first interacted. I tend to enjoy asking questions that I don't know the answers to, and trying to seek out new information in order to find answers to those questions. And I've been incredibly blessed with wonderful connections that have helped me to better understand this field that I'm so interested in. Not one of the hard truths that I've come to find is that not every effort is going to end in a paycheck. Many of the efforts are going to end in being more prepared for when the possibilities come about. And I'm sure that for most of your listeners, and certainly for you, this is not an issue. But for me, I often struggle with feelings of, oh gosh, do I have enough knowledge and understanding in order to be able to face this? Do I really know what's going on? Especially because my field of thought and my desires with regards to space law are some of the big questions. It becomes easy to think, oh gosh, do I really know what I'm talking about? But I think having an honest self-assessment of where you are and being willing to seek out more information has been absolutely pivotal for me in having the opportunities that I've had to become more involved, and then to share that knowledge and information that I have collected over time.
Thank you for sharing that, Brian. Okay, so you've spoken about the challenges of the industry. I was going to touch base on one of the earlier conversations you spoke about on volunteering. And I wanted to ask what your perspective was on volunteering, and how important do you think it is for young professionals to look for these roles where they can volunteer?
I think it's incredibly important, and I think but more importantly, and I hope that I address your question, so please correct me if I don't, but I think it's also incredibly fun. For me, like I said, I do not think, especially with the further development of the private space industry, that it's going to be hard to find a job in space. Whether it be companies in the United States, the booming industry in Africa and in Europe. There's a huge sector opening up in Japan, in China, in Australia. All of these industries need engineers, they need business managers, and they need lawyers, and they need lots of them. I don't think it will be difficult to find work in the space industry. What I think is more difficult is being a part of the overarching and what I think more interesting questions that the field of space law and policy brings up. And a lot of the times, not for everybody, there is a small group that gets to address those questions sort of professionally. But for the majority of what I consider the brilliant minds out there, their time answering those fundamental philosophical questions of what is humans' relationship to the outer space environment, and how can we use that relationship for the betterment of humankind. In order to get involved in those questions, you got to get involved with the groups that have made that part of their mission, whether it be nonprofits, whether it be educational groups, whether it be starting your own group if you have your own perspective, and bringing along those who share that perspective and adding their voice to the conversation. That's where the really fun stuff comes. And once you get involved in that really fun stuff, obviously company X or law firm Y or whatever else will look to you and say, oh, wow, if you can do that very well, then obviously you'll be able to handle the contracts for the space industry. You'll be able to take that perspective and be able to practice it in, okay, you can take that knowledge and understanding and be a litigator on tort issues or whatever else it happens to be. But I don't know if it is a necessity to be involved in the volunteer groups and opportunities, but it's definitely the fun stuff.
It's been really great speaking with you today. I would ask at this point if you have any concluding remarks.
Concluding remarks. I've been thinking about what to say at this point. Now, I'll simply say this. And I apologize if it's the same thing that many of your listeners have probably heard many times, but in my opinion, in this lawyer's opinion, we are living in the most exciting moment in space history. We have the opportunity, more things are happening in space than have ever happened before. And that ramp up of involvement means that questions that have been on the forefront of people's thinking but haven't required an answer for 50 plus years, suddenly are requiring answers. And in order to find the best answers to those questions, we need as many minds involved with the thought processes as we can possibly get. As somebody who loves thinking about that stuff, I will admit, I'm not going to have all the answers, and neither will either the amazing professors or the people who've been doing this for 50, 60 years. We need as many minds on this as is possible if we're going to be able to move forward as a species to that final frontier that we all dream of. So I would encourage anybody considering that to think for themselves that you can be involved and that you can make a difference.
Thank you for that. Okay, so if people want to connect with you, how can they do that?
I'm happy to take connections from LinkedIn. That's the platform that I tend to be the most active on. I also have a, let's see here. I also have a YouTube channel that I am active on, The Undiscovered Country. You can find me there, as well as my blog, which I can send you the link to. Happy to start conversations or to have conversations on what I personally consider to be a passion of mine and among the most important things happening in the world today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for speaking with me today, Bryant. I'm very happy to have been able to draw as much as I can from your wealth of knowledge. At Moretospacethanair, we wish you all the very best in your future endeavors, and the sky